Last Sunday, during a contemplative day hike, I stood and stared at the crashing waves for I don't know how long. I was transfixed by the rising swells. There was a narrow channel through which the waves would rush before fanning out as they approached the sand beneath my feet. They must have named the ocean that I was visiting Pacific around the same time as they named Greenland. Peaceful it was not on this day. Awe-inspiring, indeed it was. Many others moved to Vancouver Island for its moderate climate. Never mind the crashing wind that kept me up a couple of nights ago when normally I sleep like a log. Never mind the downpours that last for days sometimes. Awe-inspiring, yes. Moderate, maybe not quite so much. The timing of this particular hike last Sunday was significant for me. I had learned earlier in the week that a classmate of mine from high school had died the previous Sunday. He and his family of 4 were walking along a beach in California when a rogue wave pulled Mike and his children, aged 7 and 4, into the water. Mike tried to save them. He even grabbed on to his son, but ultimately the force of the water was too much. They pulled Mike's lifeless body back onto the beach, but the kids were never found. And so maybe going to see the crashing waves was a way for me to try to make sense of all of this. We hadn't been close, but it sure hit home. My kids are roughly the same age, and we easily could have been the subjects of that story. It could have been my partner, who is now without her immediate chosen family. So going out and finding God's presence, finding moments of awe, is one way that I was trying to make sense of this life that we live. We wonder in times like this, when there is sad news, when there's tragedy, when there are pandemics, when there are uprisings, the outcomes of which we can only speculate, we wonder, where is God? Is God, in fact, holding us? And so we, as a people of the story, gather. We assure each other that, yes, God is holding us. God is holding your life and mine. Even if God doesn't protect us from every risk, every mishap, every tragedy, God continues to hold us. In fact, it's the allure of knowing God that draws us into situations that can prove tragic. When we take a risk that forces the heart to skip a beat, isn't that actually when we feel most alive? Isn't it in those brief moments that we are closest to God? Caught in an avalanche, a person's life flashes before her eyes, and she knows now indelibly why she is alive. Powerless in a riptide, that's when the surfer understands why struggling back to the beach is worth it. Skidding across the icy road, the driver gets why they hope the ditch offers a soft landing. This life is worth living. This life is worth living. Even when there is heartbreaking death, even when there is uncertainty and chaos around us, God always accompanies us and reminds us, this life is worth living. Fortunately, we don't need to take life and death risks to be aware of God's presence. During last Sunday's hike, there were no real risks taken. We were perfectly safe the entire time. And yet, while I was seated meditating with waves crashing all around, God made God's presence known to me. While I was staring out across the water, God was visible in the ocean waves. In the silence of falling snow, Yes, even here on Vancouver Island, God's voice becomes audible. In the styrofoam crunch of cold, cold snow, God says, I am here. I am with you. This is what the psalmist tells us. God is in the crashing thunder. God is in the tree-bending wind. God is in the quaking earth. To be sure, God is also in the rainbow, the gentle brook, and the peaceful mountain vista. It's all God. And through it all, God whispers invitations. In every moment, God calls each of us to something. God calls us to do something or be a certain way. When we still ourselves, even if just for a few moments, we hear these calls. It's not always audible. In fact, it seldom is. I've never heard a voice that I would say is God's. Others claim to have heard it. Usually it's visceral. It's in our guts. Or in our conversations with other people. When I still myself, I gain the clarity to see, oh, I really need to forgive that person, or ask for forgiveness. Or, I haven't heard from this person for a while. I wonder how they're doing. I think I'll check in. Or, I've been asking my children to be someone other than their true selves, and I need to stop that. We all need moments of clarity that come from the awe and wonder of attuning to God's presence. We all need moments of clarity that come from the awe and wonder of attuning to God's presence. I encourage each of us to create or continue or recreate a discipline of attuning in contemplation to God's invitations. This might mean going for a hike with at least a few minutes to contemplate in silence, or making art, or doing a puzzle, or meditating, or any of a number of practices, even those practices we tend to resist. For me, that's journaling. I have two theories that undergird most of my actions in life these days. They're not fully fleshed out, so I beg your indulgence as I sound them out with you. The first theory is that most of the ills that happen in the world, most of what we might call evil, comes from a disintegration of brain function, if you will. In other words, it comes from people acting out of fear or instinct rather than acting out of love and thought. And so in the spiritual practices, when we take the time to attune to God's presence, when we just slow down and allow our brains to reintegrate, then we can use the prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, rather than the very inside, the amygdala that reptiles also have, to make better decisions, to act out of love, to consider what's best for all of us, rather than just what's best for my state of fear right now. And we can see this in prominent world leaders right now. I won't name any names, but acting out of fear or, greed or ego, rather than being able to take the big picture. And I believe that is just a state of a person's brain, actually. So when Jesus showed us these contemplative practices by taking 40 days in the desert, by going up into a mountaintop to pray, he's teaching us how to spread love by starting with ourselves. Now, the second theory that I'm working on these days, and I've been told that this is actually just my privilege speaking, so if that's the case, then feel free to call me on this. The second theory is that for just about everybody's life, most of the individual moments, most individual breaths are wonderful. There are times of trauma, there are times of intense fear, there are situations of abuse. This moment, this breath right now, is a beautiful one. And the more present that I can be to that breath, the less I allow past traumas or anxieties about the future to govern what I do. to control me. So I believe that we each have a duty, in fact, to integrate our brains as much as possible, to be our fully thinking and fully loving selves, and to be thankful for this moment in which God is present and that comes from God. My friends, God is holding us. God is speaking to us. In all times, in all places, God's voice is there, reminding us that we are fully loved just as we are, and encouraging us to love fully and fiercely and courageously. Our task is to pay attention to that voice. First, to still ourselves, then to listen, then to discern what, in fact, it is asking us to do or how it is asking us to be. But those whispers are always there. Our task is to dwell in those moments of awe and truly soak in the invitations, allow them to permeate our skin and our being. Soak in those invitations that God continually offers. God invites us constantly, continuously, over and over. God is saying, come, do this. Come, be like that. Come, I love you just as you are. The invitation is constant. God holds us. May we know the peace of those truths. May we live into God's promise of new life, made known in the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus.